Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squared for boxing news and views from around the internet. We said it was a mismatch, it proved to be a mismatch. Jarrell Miller walks through Tomasz Adamek, has no trouble at all, stops him in the second round. This really was not a good fight, but it was a good finish by Miller. So Adamek, he came out, he was game, he was trying to stick and move, work the body. That was pretty much what he was doing the entire fight, but Miller just walking him down, walking through his shots, didn't really take much punishment, or he didn't look like he took much punishment. He almost buckled Adamek over in the first round with a body shot, which didn't even land clean. And from that point, it looked like it was always going to be curtains for Adamek. It didn't look like he was going to last any significant length of time in this fight. And so it proved. Second round, Miller comes out, continues to follow up, lands a heavy right uppercut. Adamek is all over the place, stumbling back. Miller on the follow-up lands another heavy uppercut, and Adamek is down to the canvas. And then he was out. So it was two right uppercuts that ended it. It was a good finish for Jarrell Miller, but it was what it was. He needed to stop Tomasz Adamek because this was a blatant cherry pick. Let's not mince words. Jarrell Miller cherry-picked a faded and rinsed Tomasz Adamek, and he beat him to a pulp in this fight, and that's what he should have done. It was expected. So I find it hard to give too much credit to Miller for that performance, just because that's what he should be doing to guys like Adamek, who are really at the tail end of their career and haven't shown much for years. Adamek hasn't really had a top-level win at heavyweight for about 5 or 6 years now. He hasn't been a factor in the division. It was a blatant cherry pick, and it was a fight that really shouldn't have been made. Jarrell Miller, he's a top 10 contender. He shouldn't be facing the likes of an Adamek who's well on the downslide. He needs to be facing guys who are either in their prime or not too far removed from it. And Adamek, he was game, but there was nothing on his punches. He didn't seem to have anything in his arsenal to really trouble Miller, and Miller barely broke a sweat. And remember, he came into this fight at 317 pounds. We didn't really get to sort of see how that would affect Miller because it only went 2 rounds. So he may well be inspired to keep up at that career heaviest weight. But it's good for fans that this fight is now in the rear view because it was a joke of a fight. It shouldn't have been made. And Miller had no business fighting a Tomasz Adamek, especially given where he is at in his career. I get he took it as a sort of stay busy type of fight, but they tried to sell it to us as a credible threat in Adamek, and it just wasn't the case. And no wonder Jarrell Miller has had a bit of stink eye from the fans, because it wasn't a fight fans wanted to see, but at least he did the business. He didn't do any overtime, and he got Adamek out of there early. So there's some credit to be had in terms of he did what he had to do. After the fight, he sort of said his aim from training camp was to come forward, let his hands go, and have fun. And that's essentially what we saw, and it was only for, a round and a half. But in terms of, he was asked about why he was putting a belt on in the corner, and he made a comment. It was sort of a little bit curious for me, because he said he put this belt on. I didn't actually see it myself, but he said he put it on because he wanted to show he wasn't just the champion of New York. He wanted to show that he wasn't just a champion of America, that he could be a world champion. And I thought that is some stuff from Jarrell Miller that we haven't heard him say before, because he's been all about boxing on his home turf, and he hasn't wanted to travel. And he talked about Bulgaria. He didn't want to travel there to face Kubrat Pulev, and he lost a lot of credit and face with fans when he turned down that IBF final eliminator, which would have guaranteed him a shot at Anthony Joshua should he have got through that fight. And on Joshua, of course, the ring announcer afterwards was asking him a question, do you think you've earned a title shot? And he said, yes, I have earned my title shot. And he sort of seemed a little bit put out that that question had been asked, because Miller thinks that the body of work of Gerald Washington, Marius Wok, and Johann Dorper is enough for a title shot. Debatable about that, but in terms of should he be fighting Anthony Joshua, he was asked that question too, and he actually said, and I had actually laughed out loud to this, he said Eddie Hearn has been keeping Joshua away from Miller. He said he's been keeping him away from me. And I thought, well, this is just delusional stuff, because it's not true. Miller hasn't really been on the radar. He's been kind of on the periphery, but that's it. No, there's been no real demand for that fight, no matter what Jarrell Miller thinks. We know he's a legend in his own lunchbox, and it's a quite sizable lunchbox filled with, 6,000 cheeseburgers. It's not a fight that fans are begging for. And why is that? Because Miller has been facing faded contenders of the likes of Dorper, Wok, and before that Washington, and now Adamek. This is why he's not getting any closer to a title shot, because no one is wanting to see those sorts of fights, or Miller in those sorts of fights. Well, some of those, to be fair, they were on the come up. They were the sort of progression fights, but then he's just tapered off. So next, now that this is in the rear view, he's got to take a fight that fans want to see, that is going to give him credit, that can build some hype and some buzz, because Miller, genuinely, even though I do give him a lot of stick for some of his recent antics, he's going to be a tough cover for anyone in the division. Better believe that. Jarrell Miller is going to be a hard man to stop. 300 plus pounds, and emphasis on the plus now that he's at 317. Coming forward, decent chin. Who's going to be able to stop him? I think he would hands down beat probably half the guys in the top 15, top 20. Just right off the bat you go, okay, I'd probably favour Miller to beat that guy. But because we don't know how good he is, because he's tapered off, that's limited his growth in terms of, hype, how fans see him, and the expectations of him. But he is going to be a tough customer for the likes of the champions to deal with and other top contenders. So Dimitri Salita, his promoter, has this week said that Miller, he's hoping to get a shot at the WBA regular title. We don't know what's happening with that belt. Manuel Cha, the holder, tested allegedly for steroids. He believes that he's proved that he's innocent. WBA have not clarified that situation. But regardless, if the WBA is not an option, Miller needs to have a next good fight on his second and final fight of his 2-fight deal with DAZN. I don't think Eddie Hearn is going to allow Jarrell Miller to take another soft fight, especially if there is a prospect that Miller could bolt, take 2 fights, Tomasz Adamek type fights, and then sail off into the sunset. And actually, it was quite funny. This week was the first time I've really heard Jarrell Miller play the game. In recent months, after he'd signed this 2-fight deal with DAZN, he's been telling multiple media outlets that he would much prefer to be with a Showtime, or a then HBO, who's now getting out of boxing. He's been not really saying much of note or much nice about DAZN. But this week, fight week, he has played the game. Said a number of complimentary things, which I thought, this is the sort of thing as a signed fighter that he should have been doing already. Maybe now that he's got his promotional company, he's starting to ramp that up. He realizes he actually does have to play the game. Or potentially he's had the hard word. Look, if you want another contract, you actually have to talk this product up. Because he hasn't been until recently. And I saw an interview that he did do with Fight Hype where he said, over the next 8 or 9 months, I'm going to stop talking as much about Anthony Joshua, which his post-fight comments sort of, doesn't really gel with what he said there. But he said he would talk less, and he's looking to boost his profile. And he talked about coming out to the UK, coming to London, coming to the harder areas and suburbs and whatnot in London to get a bit of a lay of the land, meet the people, get an idea about what the place is about. So we'll have to see what happens there, because I guess his timescale, 8 or 9 months, that would suggest he thinks that the Anthony Joshua fight, for him at least, is not viable for April. And I think about 99.9% of people would agree with him that he is not really in the running. There's an outside chance, but he's not really in the running for April. But more likely, in the second half of next year, that could be probable. A lot of people speculate that the next sort of running order is Dillian Whyte, Jarrell Miller, and Alexander Usyk for Anthony Joshua. And it could well play out that way. So Miller, he is in the queue. How far back, we just don't really know, but not in line for April, I wouldn't think. But this performance, it was what it was. He did his job. He didn't do any overtime, as he sort of said before the fight. He didn't want to do overtime, and he certainly didn't muck about. couple of good uppercuts. He showed he's got some power, but I think against a more prime contender, if he'd have faced someone that wasn't as rinsed as Adamek, I'm not sure some of those blows would have had quite the impact. But yeah, I'll give Miller his due. He did what he needed to do. What do you make of it all? Did you rate that performance from Jarrell Miller? What's next for Miller? What should he be doing? Does he really have a chance at the WBA regular title, or do they actually need to look further afield? And should Eddie Hearn be having a bit more say in the next fight, given Miller will be doing a second fight for DAZN? I can't see Hearn being too enthused with another Miller v Adamek type opponent. Neither am I, because if he takes another fight like that, well, his credibility is just going to go into the toilet. I mean, even taking on Manuel Cha, I mean, who's really going to be looking forward to that? Or if it's Fraser Kendo, who really wants to see that? Or even Trevor Bryan, who really wants to see that? It's not going to really prove anything. Those guys, even Trevor Bryan and Cha, even though they've got belts, and Kendo has a court order to fight for a belt, they're not the guys that Miller should be fighting. They're secondary guys, if not even further down the pecking order. Drop a comment loud and often, hit like, hit subscribe, follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. I'm out.